I used to do counts of where shorebirds were feeding at low tide. So every one of these dots is a site where benthos was sampled by the programs that Grant and Andrew and Sora will be talking about. I had a 200 metre square around each block, and I used to count the shorebirds in it, walking out to each one. And it was very nice indeed walking on these flats and doing the counts at low tide. In the Eastern Bay it wasn't so nice. It was very hard work walking through the mud, and when you stopped it got even harder because you'd set your telescope kind of low, so you look like that, and then you start sinking and sinking and sinking as you go through, and then you stop counting because you can't reach your telescope anymore. And this is some of the distribution maps I got. This one's for gull-billed tern, subspecies macrotarsa, which I used to see standing around the mud flats. I didn't know why, I counted them anyway. The second thing is normally an index of what we consider their prey, but I've put the Wimbrel map here. So the shading represents Wimbrel density and the round circles represent gull-billed terns. Curious thing was that gull-billed terns were always in the same grid square as a Wimbrel, or right next to a grid square with a Wimbrel. And I eventually worked out why, because it turned out the gull-billed terns were not sitting on a mud flat having a rest. They were sitting on a mud flat staring at Wimbrels, which were hunting large crabs. And when the Wimbrel caught a crab, the gull-billed tern would fly over and beat up the Wimbrel and steal the crab. It was often quite an equal fight, and sometimes the crab got broken into pieces and the birds got half each. But exciting to watch. And then there were different patterns. Black-tailed godwit really likes the sloppy sediment around south of Crab Creek. That was mostly down there. In contrast, there's not much food for grey-tailed tattlers in that sloppy stuff. They like the firmer tidal flats in the west of the bay. Redneck stints and pteric sandpipers. The key thing I was going to show here is that they don't go out all the way to the tide edge. They're mostly on tidal flats near shore or somewhere in the middle. Redneck stints occur pretty much everywhere. Pteric sandpipers, quite patchy. There's a lot of them feeding on the Dampier Creek flats, quite a lot in front of the observatory, where the sediment's totally different. And those are still foraging strongholds today, although I did this mapping in '97. But in contrast to these birds that like the sort of inner tidal flats, you've got birds like godwits and knots, which always follow the sea edge quite closely, and they're mostly next to the water's edge. That's where you find the big numbers. And we did some experiments to try and figure out why that was, and it was because they were hunting prey that doesn't like getting desiccated at high tide. So bivalves, they stick their foot out and use it to forage when the tidal flats are covered with water, but when the tide goes out, they burrow deeper so that they don't get dried out. And as they burrow deeper, they get out of reach of shorebirds. So if shorebirds follow the receding tide edge closely, they can catch the food that they want to before it's out of reach. Tidal flats are not... for 12 hours a day, the tidal flats of Roebuck Bay are submerged. And at those times, shorebirds gather in flocks at sites that are called roosts. It's a bit of a misleading name, because when shorebirds are at roost, they're not always roosting. More often than not, they're not sleeping, they're just loafing and preening and looking around for danger. They look at, if they see anything scary coming, they take off and get on the wing. When they're on the ground like this, they're vulnerable. They take a little while to take off. Once they're in the air and flying at full speed, almost nothing can catch a shorebird. And by the late 1990s, we knew the northern beaches of Roebuck Bay were very spectacular shorebird roosts, and we knew roughly when shorebirds would be there and when the cannon netters could catch them. But we didn't know where shorebirds roosted on neap tides, and where they roosted on spring tides, and where they roosted at night. So I'll go into those studies, but just as background for those of you who haven't spent much time on mudflats, just an explanation of tides. So when the full moon, the tides are caused by the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon, and when the sun and the moon much in line, the gravitational pull is in much the same direction. So the water sort of comes out, it sort of bulges further from the centre of the Earth, and you have bigger tides. When the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun are opposing each other, you have smaller tides, neaps. which we call neaps. And neap tides, you have a very low tidal range. It's just a few metres. That's shown by the grey shading in this graph. Spring tides, you have a very big tidal range, so the high tide comes up a very long way, the low tide goes out a very long way. The tidal range in Roebuck Bay is up to 10 metres on the very biggest spring tides, which is amongst the world's biggest tides. And also the tides get half, the black dots are just demonstrating that the tides run half an hour later every day, roughly. So with that background in mind, we'll go on to the radio tracking study we did of roosts back in 2000 on the Tracking 2000 expedition. We wrote a couple of papers about it. We attached small radio tags to 25 great knots and to 23 red knots. This is one of the radio tags being glued to the rump plumage. Once the bird had preened itself, all you could see of it was the antenna coming out of the back. We released the birds and we tracked their movements with an array of automatic radio tracking stations around the bay. These are shown by the black dots. Most of them are around the northern shores of Roebuck Bay. We had one station at Bush Point, one or two stations that might come as a surprise. We had one at Simpson's Beach where it turned out there were a lot of shorebirds at the time. We had one right here at the Mangrove Hotel, which was a very popular station when we were doing battery changes. It commanded the tidal flats of Dampier Creek very nicely, and also Chris had done some serious research at the Mangrove Hotel. He was very dedicated. He used to have to come here for dinner. And as dusk fell, you used to get, in some conditions, you used to get flocks of knots sweeping through the searchlights, the spotlights here, and flying over the town of Broome. After careful research by Chris, we found that the birds were actually flying to Cable Beach, not the most touristy bit of Cable Beach, a little bit further south. There's a big blowout in the dunes, so just nice white dunes fronting onto the beach, and no street lights, and the waders roost there at night. It's a quite remarkable sight. So if you go in there really quietly with a torch, a lot of the waders are actually sleeping, and you can sort of creep up to within 5 metres or less of them. It's a lovely sight. But you mustn't say ooh nah too loudly because you'll scare them off. They're very flighty. The stations, most of them we put on high ground of some sort, on cliff tops and the like, and that was fine. Each station had an antenna connected by cable to a box in which we had a receiver and a little computer to log the data. We had a couple of sites in mangroves and at Dampier Creek and in the Crab Creek mangroves. We had to build towers for those, and we put those up. It was fun putting them up, but we carefully observed OH&S protocols, so it was all right. We got about 6 million records from the automatic radio tracking stations, and we could summarise them in graphs like this for every bird. So here, along the bottom axis, you've got the time of day. Along this axis, you've got the day of the month. It's a fairly ugly graph because we were just using these in the field to check see how things were developing and check that our equipment was working. But you can see patterns in this when you get your eye in. So this area where things are messy, it's a neap tide. And on neap tides, we found that all the birds in the bay basically went to one area in the east of the bay on the Crab Creek flats. But on intermediate tides, this bird was feeding at Quarry Beach and sometimes at Simpson's Beach, sometimes Eagle's Roost, and at night it was always roosting on Cable Beach, and you can see the tides moving late, and that's why these lines are diagonal. Anyway, we had that sort of information from 48 birds, and we tried to thread it into a model. We recorded habitat attributes at every site where we were radio tracking, and assessed their contribution to the roost selection by knots. Microclimate turned out to be incredibly important. So Roebuck Bay, it can be hot up here, and it is hot up here. Shorebirds don't cope very well with heat because they're carrying a plumage that they're also going to be carrying on the breeding grounds where temperatures are only just above zero and quite often below zero. So often they'll get to the breeding grounds and have a late snowstorm, and they'll be digging through snow to try and find something to eat. So they need a plumage that can cope with that. And well, you'd know it's hard to find clothing that you'd wear in Broome and that you'd wear in the Arctic. So they have ploys to deal with it. When they're very heat stressed, they'll pant. This is something you normally only see after they've been flying, because it costs energy and water. Often they'll just lift the feathers on the back of their neck when it's a hot day. That'll let some heat escape from the plumage. But the most important trick is standing on wet substrates. If on a hot day, stick your feet in a bucket of cold water, you'll start to feel more comfortable. It's that principle. If they're standing on dry ground, they're exposed to very high temperatures. The ground temperatures on dry beaches and so on get way over 41 degrees, which is body temperature of the birds. So if they're standing on dry ground, it's increasing their body temperature, not bringing it down. So it's very important for them to stand in water or on wet ground at high tide. Distance from feeding areas is obviously important. The closer you are to the closer from the roost to the feeding area, the better. You don't need to fly so far, you don't need to use so much energy. More energy gets invested in building up fuel for your next migration. Distance from tall cover was very important. Shorebirds don't like tall things, so if vegetation is more than 1 metre tall, it might conceal predators that are approaching, and birds of prey might use it as cover. So shorebirds really won't readily stand within 10 metres of anything that's tall, and they prefer to be more than 60 metres away. And background colour turned out to be a surprisingly important thing, but only at night. By day, shorebirds can see danger coming, that's fine, but at night, if you've got an owl or something like that approaching from cover of mangroves, you can't see it if it's against a dark background. If it's against a white background, such as the dunes of Cable Beach, you can see it coming. Anyway, we modelled this. We had conditional logic models, which were fairly fancy, mostly for the benefit of scientific publication. And they assumed that the birds were omnipotent, that they knew everything, the condition of every roost around the bay, and then they did a complex calculation to figure out where they should roost. Actually described where knots for roosting very well, but we had even better models, which were bounds models, which just assumed that the birds followed those simple rules above. Anyway, it was the final model was quite simple, but it led to complex movements in the bay. So on neap tides, birds always had these mud banks on the Crab Creek flats to fly to. They could roost there by day, they could roost there by night, because the tides just didn't get high enough to cover those mud banks. But then on tides of intermediate heights, 6.8 to 9 metres, those mud banks were covered. However, so the birds moved to the northern beaches of the Roebuck Bay, the famous roosts that appear in the tourist literature and so on. That's where they roost in those tide heights. But strangely enough, they don't roost there at night, and we think that's because the cliffs behind those beaches are dark red and they're vegetated. They can't see predators coming. Those beaches are quite lonely at night, not many shorebirds on them. So at night they'll go to one of two places. If they're feeding in the east side of the bay, they'll fly to one of these salt pans behind the mangroves. Often these salt pans are dry, so they can't use them for roosting by day, but at night that doesn't matter. There's no direct solar radiation, so they'll go and roost there. And the birds from the west of the bay fly over to feed at Cable Beach. On low springs, they make use of clearings in the mangroves. It's very hard to get to them, but it's a lovely sight. There's these big open areas in the mangroves. Not huge areas, so the birds are quite about as close as they'd like to get to vegetation. But they'll roost there. You sneak in, you wait for the tide to come in, the birds burst in front of you, and then the tide just gradually rises through the mangroves at a steady walking pace, not a ripple in the water. And the birds walk inland for about 400 metres, and the tide turns and the birds walk out for 400 metres. And by the time they've got back to where they started, they know the tidal flats are free again, so they're off to feed. On really massive spring tides, the really massive spring tides are big enough to flood the salt pans, so the shorebirds have somewhere to roost in those conditions, and they roost in places where they're hard to get to. We did have some practical applications for these roost choice models. We can calculate the energetic costs of roost disturbance. This table here illustrates this sort of data. This is what a lean great knot can do with 2.8 kilojoules of energy, which is what it basically gets from one big bivalve. There's enough energy in that bivalve to sustain a great knot while it's sleeping for 6 hours. But if it's awake and just looking around, its brain's active, it can only keep going for 217 minutes. If it's actively foraging, it can go for 159 minutes. If it's digesting food while it's foraging, that's more energy consumption, and it can keep going for 107 minutes. If it takes flight, that one bivalve will fuel 26 minutes of steady flight. But when birds take off because they're disturbed, they're flying as fast as they can, they're climbing, they're wheeling around, the energy costs are much higher. So one bivalve's worth of energy, it will keep a knot sleeping for 6 hours, but it will only keep it in flight when it's scared off for 7.5 minutes. So you can see that disturbance like this, it looks trivial when you see it, especially in a bird that migrates from one side of the world to the other, but that sort of flight can be a bit of a killer for a great knot. That can stop it reaching the energy level, it can stop it from building up the fat it needs to migrate successfully. So this is why you hear lots of concern about disturbance at roosts. Some disturbance studies have been done in Roebuck Bay by the hard-working volunteers of Broome Bird Observatory. Most of them were hard-working. I think Mr. Trudgeon was looking at a beach here where the shorebirds had just been disturbed by a bird of prey, so there was nothing there. That would explain that. But the studies demonstrated very high levels of shorebird disturbance in Roebuck Bay. There's a lot of disturbance. An awful lot of it is natural from birds of prey, but human visitation is building the pressure. And if you calculate the energy costs of the disturbance, it's almost got to the point where shorebirds feeding in the northern side of Roebuck Bay would be better off flying 30 kilometres south to Bush Point to roost rather than staying here. So we're quite close to the edge. It's something to be monitored quite carefully in future. Roost choice studies also helped us figure out the most repeatable way to do our counts. So we know exactly what time of year to do it. We've got to do it before the wet season rains become and salt pans and so on become flooded and provide shorebirds with alternate roosts. We know exactly what height of tide we should count on, and we've got this sort of information for the south of Roebuck Bay and for 80 Mile Beach as well. And we've been counting those areas systematically since 2004. We do 2 summer counts, which are big jobs. We see 2 to 300,000 shorebirds during a count. We do 1 count in winter, which is not so many birds to count, but there's more disturbance from birds of prey and tourists in Roebuck Bay, and the winter counts are quite tricky as well. But we've got some data we're quite happy with. That describes the count methodology. Here's an example of some of the count models we've got. This is bar-tailed godwits. In our entire stud area, it is going downhill. It's been going downhill at 80 Mile Beach. It's been going downhill more steeply in Roebuck Bay. And at Bush Point, it's actually been increasing. And we suspect that could be a first indication of the disturbance problem. Most of the bar-tailed godwits we count on the northern beaches of Roebuck Bay. They used to be in the east of the bay towards One Tree Point. There's not so much disturbance in the summer months, which is good for shorebirds, but in that far eastern corner of the bay, there's been some mangrove encroachment, and we don't think the roosts are as favourable as they used to be. It is actually very lucky that most of the disturbance problems on the beaches of the bay happen during the dry season. That's when there's people here, that's when birds of prey are in largest numbers, but it's luckily when the adult shorebirds are mostly in Siberia, so not so many birds are affected by the dry season disturbance. So that's the Roebuck Bay picture of the counts, but it's not just the local picture that's important. Shorebird counts are carried out by volunteers at many Australian shorebird sites. I think Dan Weller's going to be talking about this later. Roebuck Bay is one of the hardest areas to count. We've certainly got more birds than anyone else, but it's happening at dozens, hundreds of sites, especially in southern Australia. The University of Queensland, the Australasian Way to Studies Group, BirdLife Australia, the Ornithological Society of New Zealand, lots of other regional groups have pulled together. We pulled together all of our data and analysed it. The analysis was led by the University of Queensland. Some very important papers. Rob Clemens demonstrated that shorebird declines are occurring throughout Australia, possibly less steeply in northwestern Australia than elsewhere, but it's basically happening everywhere, so you can't attribute the declines all to local factors. Turnus Piersma and his colleagues from NEOS demonstrated that shorebird declines are being driven by increased mortality of adults. They're just not living as long. and that this increased mortality is not happening in Australia, it's happening while they're migrating. Colin Stubbs demonstrated that shorebird declines coincide very closely with destruction of tidal flats in the Yellow Sea. This is the Yellow Sea up here. Most migration routes of most species seem to converge on the Yellow Sea. It's incredibly rich tidal flats and very strategically placed, so birds can use it as their launching point before they go off to the breeding grounds in Siberia. It's also one of the most densely inhabited areas of the world, with China and the Koreas right next to it, countries with very high populations. These Google Earth images are Saemongum, which is on the west side of South Korea, where I did a study from 2006 to 2008 with a lot of other people. What happened at Saemongum, you had two rivers, the Mangyang and the Dongjin, flowing out into this fantastically rich estuary, the most shorebird-rich, benthos-rich estuary that was known in this entire flyway, certainly the best I've ever seen. But also on this map you'll see this great big seawall. At the start of 2006 it was still under construction, the tides were still going in, they were somewhat modified but they were still big tides, 5 metre range. You had, these grey areas were all tidal flats with crazy numbers of shorebirds on them. Just like flocks of 60,000 great knots. When they're all flying at one point, you can hear them from 2 or 3 kilometres, just the whir of wings. It's spectacular. 2007, the seawall had been closed. These tidal flats were all underwater all the time. The remaining tidal flats never got a high tide over them, so they're just drying to white. Shorebirds virtually gone. This is the vision for the future when they started the construction of Saemongum. Now they think they're going to turn it into what they call an eco-city, but it's not very eco. It's hard to imagine unless you've seen it, but this is what it looked like just after the tides started coming in. Every cockle in Saemongum rose to the surface and died. The scale of it was terrible. It was actually a bonus for knots in the first year, because all these things came to the surface and they popped open, so they had a season eating carrion, a migration eating carrion, but next year when they came back there was no mud flat to feed on. This is depressing, so I want to end by giving some reasons why I think there's hope. One of them is that shorebirds are awesome. I seem to have forgotten to fill in this slide, but that's actually the key message. They're incredibly resilient birds. They can find if a habitat comes around with suitable shorebird foraging habitat, somehow they find it. If you destroy a roost, somehow they manage to find one somewhere else, even if it involves flying sort of 2 hours a day to get to and from it. They're very resourceful. If we give them any opportunities, they'll leave them any remaining opportunities, they'll find them. I take a lot of pleasure from this graph in an odd sort of way. This is Saemongum again, or what remains of it. Just to the north of it, there's the Broome estuary. When we went to Saemongum, we were hoping to get it stopped, but it was too late. Billions of dollars had been invested. We were never going to stop it. But there was also a reclamation project planned for the Broome estuary, which is a fantastic site. It's a beautiful area. And this project did get stopped. We and many other protesters kicked up such a fuss about Saemongum that plans to reclaim the Broome estuary were shelved. And the Broome estuary is still there with its massive mud flats. I particularly like this highway here. It's a 6-line highway. It runs to the coast. It just stops because it was going to a development that we stopped. So it makes me optimistic. And it was lots of pressure groups involved, but also the Korean government sort of acknowledging, yeah, we've gone a bit too far. And so that's my second reason for believing them. There's hope. I think governments are starting to appreciate the importance of shorebirds. They've probably got it in Australia for quite a long time ago, although I have a letter from Tony Burke in 2007 saying the court's still out about whether shorebirds are endangered, whether reclamation's got anything to do with it about it. But Australia's moved on from that. It's well acknowledged by the Australian state governments that shorebirds are in trouble and they need to do their bit to stop it. We've got strong conservation legislation which is basically followed. It's not too bad in Australia by international standards. Japan has overdone its tidal flat reclamation. They basically wiped out most of their really good shorebird sites, but the ones that remain, they're now looking after very well, and they're even considering reversal of some of the tidal flat reclamations that have been done in the past. Korea's sort of followed the same economic thing. They want, for economic growth, massive construction, but I think they haven't destroyed as many of their tidal flats before they started to get wise. In 2008, they announced that they would not authorise any further reclamation. I put reclamation in inverted commas because I don't like it. Reclamation is the term people use for destroying tidal flats and converting them to land, but they're not being reclaimed as land because they never were land. China, this year, Chris will be talking more about this, they announced sweeping legal changes to curb commercial developments of coastal wetlands. If everything that's on paper comes true, it'd be unbelievably good. Of course, strong conservation words or legislation don't always turn into effective conservation, but it's definitely a start. There's a framework there that you can make things happen with. And that brings me to the third reason for being hopeful. Governments do have more impressive aspirations than they can handle, but when they meet their targets, it's normally because the community wants them to. And the shorebird community has been kicking a lot